The moment Ibrahim Traoré extended a hand to North Korea, the geopolitical rules of the Sahel were rewritten. Not because Pyongyang holds the key to Burkina Faso's future, but because the gesture itself carried a message louder than any communique. We no longer ask permission. In a region still haunted by colonial legacies and perpetual intervention, this wasn't diplomacy as usual. This was defiance dressed in formality, a deliberate provocation aimed at every Western capital that once dictated terms to Ouagadougou. North Korea isn't a conventional ally. It's one of the most isolated, heavily sanctioned states on the planet, politically untouchable by the architecture of liberal international order. So why would a young military leader in West Africa risk association with a pariah regime? Because, for Traoré, the risk is the point. Reaching out to Pyongyang wasn't about military hardware or economic support. It was about signaling that Burkina Faso now operates in a post-Western diplomatic framework. The handshake was symbolic, but symbols carry weight when sovereignty is on trial. This outreach must be understood through the lens of the Alliance of Sahel States, the ES. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have spent the past 2 years systematically dismantling the infrastructure of French influence. Military bases closed, ambassadors expelled, currencies questioned. Each step has been a public rejection of the old order. But rejection alone doesn't define a foreign policy. You need alternatives, even uncomfortable ones, to prove the system can function without the usual gatekeepers. North Korea, in this context, becomes useful not despite its isolation, but because of it. Engaging Pyongyang demonstrates that Sahelian states are willing to explore partnerships the West finds unacceptable, and that their definition of legitimacy no longer requires Western approval. The timing is critical. Traoré came to power through a coup in 2022, in a country spiraling into insecurity, political chaos, and economic fragility. Since then, he's positioned himself as the face of Pan-African resistance, a leader who speaks in the language of sovereignty, dignity, and anti-imperialism. His rhetoric resonates across a generation tired of seeing African governments defer to external powers while their own populations suffer. But rhetoric only goes so far. Actions like this, controversial and bold, give weight to the narrative. They show domestic and regional audiences that the AES isn't just talk, it's a genuine realignment. What happens next could redefine the region. Because this move isn't happening in a vacuum. Russia has deepened its footprint across the Sahel, offering military support, trainers, and political cover. China continues to expand infrastructure projects and economic ties. Even Iran and Turkey have shown interest in filling voids left by traditional Western players. Traoré's outreach to North Korea fits into a broader pattern. The emergence of a multipolar Sahel, where alignment is transactional, flexible, and intentionally diverse. The goal isn't to replace France with Russia or the US with China. The goal is to ensure no single power holds the kind of leverage that defined the past 60 years. But there are costs. Engaging North Korea invites scrutiny, sanctions risk, and diplomatic isolation from countries that still matter economically. International financial institutions, regional bodies like ECOWAS, and potential investors may hesitate when a government starts cozying up to Pyongyang. Traoré is betting that the symbolic value, the assertion of autonomy, outweighs the material risks. He's gambling that his population will tolerate economic hardship if it comes with a promise of true independence. Whether that calculation holds depends on his ability to deliver security, stability, and results on the ground. When Burkina Faso signals openness to North Korea, it's not about Pyongyang's capabilities. It's about dismantling the assumption that African states must choose from a pre-approved list of partners. This is diplomatic rebellion, and it's happening across the Sahel in real time. The Alliance of Sahel States, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is systematically exploring ties with countries the West has labeled untouchable. North Korea is just the latest name on a list that includes actors most international forums would rather ignore. The strategy is clear: diversification as resistance, autonomy as the endgame. For decades, the Sahel operated within a confined diplomatic orbit. France held the security portfolio. The United States provided counterterrorism support. The European Union funded development projects. The International Monetary Fund shaped fiscal policy. This wasn't partnership, it was dependency dressed in the language of cooperation. Every agreement came with conditions, every dollar with strings attached. The AES is now working to sever those strings, one relationship at a time. Engaging North Korea doesn't provide immediate material benefit, but it sends an unmistakable signal. The old gatekeepers no longer control access to legitimacy. The timing reflects a fundamental shift in how these governments understand sovereignty. Traoré in Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta in Mali, and Abdurrahmane Tiani in Niger came to power through military interventions, each citing failures of the previous order to deliver security, dignity, or independence. Since then, they've pursued a foreign policy doctrine rooted in what they call strategic autonomy. That means refusing to be boxed into Cold War-style binaries or Western-led multilateral frameworks. It means treating every potential partner as transactional rather than ideological. Russia offers military support without lecturing on human rights. China builds infrastructure without political conditions. Iran and Turkey provide alternatives to European markets. And now, even North Korea becomes part of the portfolio, not because it offers much, but because it represents the principle. We choose, not you. This is where the stakes become clear. The AES isn't just rejecting individual countries or policies. It's rejecting the entire structure of post-colonial international relations. The idea that African states must operate within boundaries drawn by former colonial powers and maintained by Western-led institutions. North Korea's inclusion in this diplomatic recalibration underscores how far these governments are willing to go. Pyongyang is isolated, sanctioned, and condemned by nearly every major power. Associating with it invites scrutiny, potential penalties, and reputational damage. But for the AES, that's exactly why it works. The message is that reputational comfort within the existing international order is no longer a priority. There's no formal military or economic bloc here, no binding treaties or structured alliances. What exists is a shared posture, a collective willingness to redraw the diplomatic map without asking permission. Mali expelled French troops and invited Russian military contractors. Niger closed U.S. drone bases and opened discussions with Iran. Burkina Faso ended decades-old defense agreements and explored ties with countries that operate outside Western influence. Each move is incremental, but together they form a pattern. The Sahel is testing the limits of what sovereignty looks like in practice. What happens next could redefine the region, because this strategy only works if these states can sustain themselves through the backlash. Western governments and financial institutions won't simply accept this realignment. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and economic pressure are already tools on the table. ECOWAS, the regional body historically aligned with Western interests, has threatened intervention. Donor funding has dried up. Investment has slowed. The AES is betting that the domestic political payoff, being seen as defenders of dignity and independence, will outweigh the material costs. But that's a high-stakes wager in countries already battling jihadist insurgencies, food insecurity, and economic fragility. France didn't just lose influence in Burkina Faso. It watched a young military leader openly court one of the world's most isolated regimes as a direct challenge to decades of assumed control. When Ibrahim Traoré signaled openness to North Korea, the message wasn't meant for Pyongyang. It was meant for Paris. And the shockwaves were immediate. Because this wasn't about what North Korea could offer Burkina Faso. This was about what that relationship says to every Western capital that still believes Africa operates within their sphere of influence. For France, the Sahel has always been more than geography. It's been a cornerstone of post-colonial strategy, a region where military presence, economic ties, and political relationships reinforced Paris as the dominant external power. French troops operated across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso for years under the banner of counterterrorism. The CFA franc, controlled by the French treasury, governed monetary policy for half the region. Diplomatic channels ran through Paris before they reached Brussels or Washington. This wasn't partnership in any meaningful sense. It was dependency institutionalized and sustained across generations. But that architecture is collapsing, and Traoré's outreach to North Korea is the latest brick pulled from the foundation. The symbolism alone is devastating. North Korea represents everything the Western-led international order claims to stand against: isolation, sanctions, defiance of democratic norms, and rejection of multilateral institutions. By engaging Pyongyang, Traoré is making a calculated statement that Burkina Faso no longer operates within the moral or strategic boundaries set by the West. He's saying that legitimacy doesn't require French approval, American endorsement, or European recognition. He's saying that sovereignty means choosing partners freely, even controversial ones, and that the era of asking permission is over. This is where the stakes become clear. Because France isn't losing Burkina Faso in isolation. Mali expelled French forces in 2022 and invited Russian military contractors. Niger closed American drone bases and ended defense agreements. Chad, long considered France's most reliable ally in the region, has begun renegotiating terms. Senegal, under new leadership, is questioning decades-old arrangements. Across the Sahel, governments are publicly rejecting the assumption that their security, economy, and foreign policy must align with Western interests. Traoré's move isn't an anomaly. It's part of a coordinated erosion of the post-colonial order, and Western capitals are struggling to respond. For Paris and its allies, this represents more than lost influence. It challenges the entire framework through which they've understood African geopolitics. The assumption has always been that African states, particularly in the Sahel, need Western support more than the West needs them. That military aid, development funding, and diplomatic backing create leverage. That historical ties translate into enduring partnerships. But Traoré and leaders like him are proving that dependency can be unilateral, that historical ties can become liabilities, and that confrontation can be a viable strategy when the old order no longer delivers. What happens next could redefine the region, because France still has economic interests, cultural institutions, and remnants of military presence scattered across West Africa. But those holdings are increasingly vulnerable to governments willing to challenge them publicly. The CFA franc is under scrutiny. French companies face pressure. Military bases that once operated with minimal oversight are now flashpoints for nationalist mobilization. Traoré's openness to North Korea amplifies this vulnerability, showing domestic and regional audiences that alternatives exist, even uncomfortable ones, and that breaking with the West doesn't mean isolation or collapse. The broader implication extends beyond Franco-African relations. This confrontational posture is reshaping global hierarchies in real time. China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and now even North Korea are positioned as viable partners precisely because they don't carry the baggage of colonialism or the conditions of Western aid. They offer transactional relationships without lectures on governance, human rights, or democratic standards. For countries like Burkina Faso, that's not a compromise. It's a feature. It allows them to maintain sovereignty while accessing resources, support, and diplomatic cover that were once monopolized by the West. The Sahel just forced the continent into a debate it's been avoiding for decades. What does sovereignty actually cost? Ibrahim Traoré's outreach to North Korea didn't just divide opinions. It split the region along a fault line that's been building since the first French military base closed. On one side, supporters see a leader willing to defy the global order in pursuit of true independence. On the other, critics see recklessness that could invite retaliation Africa isn't equipped to handle. The reaction has been sharp, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Because this isn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. This is about whether the entire continent is ready to operate outside the rules it never agreed to in the first place. For supporters across Africa, Traoré's move is electric. It's a kind of defiance that gets replayed in social media clips, quoted in university debates, and framed as evidence that African leadership is finally reclaiming agency. The narrative is simple and powerful. For too long, African states have been told who they can partner with, what policies they can pursue, and how they must behave to maintain access to international markets and institutions. Traoré's willingness to engage North Korea, a state condemned and sanctioned by the West, signals that those days are ending. It tells a generation tired of conditional sovereignty that autonomy isn't something you ask for, it's something you take. This rhetoric resonates not just in the Sahel, but across a continent where resentment toward foreign interference runs deep and where the promise of independence has always felt incomplete. But the critics aren't operating from fear alone. They're pointing to real risks that come with confronting the international order head-on. Engaging North Korea invites scrutiny from Western governments already wary of the Sahel's pivot toward Russia and China. It gives ammunition to those pushing for sanctions, aid cuts, and diplomatic isolation. It complicates relationships with international financial institutions that still hold significant leverage over African economies. And it raises the stakes in a region already struggling with jihadist insurgencies, food insecurity, and fragile state capacity. The concern isn't that Traoré is wrong to seek autonomy. The concern is that the method, courting one of the world's most isolated regimes, could backfire spectacularly if the West decides to make an example out of Burkina Faso. This is where the stakes become clear. Because the debate isn't really about North Korea. It's about whether African states can navigate a polarized global system without getting crushed in the process. The world is splitting into competing blocks faster than at any point since the Cold War. The United States and its allies are doubling down on democratic governance frameworks and rules-based multilateralism. China and Russia are offering alternative partnerships built on non-interference and transactional cooperation. Smaller powers like Turkey and Iran are carving out their own spheres of influence. And in the middle of all this, the Sahel is trying to chart a course that refuses alignment with any single bloc. Traoré's engagement with North Korea is a test case for that strategy. If it works, if Burkina Faso can maintain relationships across ideological divides without suffering crippling consequences, it proves that true non-alignment is possible. If it fails, it proves the opposite, that defiance without power is just noise. What happens next could redefine the region. The international response is still forming. France has already signaled displeasure. The United States is monitoring closely. ECOWAS, the regional body, remains divided between members aligned with Western interests and those sympathetic to the AES. Meanwhile, Russia and China are watching to see if their investments in Sahelian influence pay off. Every actor is calculating, waiting to see whether Traoré's gamble strengthens his position or leaves him isolated and vulnerable. The central question remains unanswered. Will this bold diplomatic signaling ultimately strengthen African autonomy, or will it expose the Sahel to intensified geopolitical confrontation it can't sustain? Traoré is betting that the symbolic power of defiance, the inspiration it provides to other African leaders and populations, outweighs the material risks. He's betting that the West's leverage is weaker than it appears, and that alternatives exist if traditional partners withdraw. But that's a high-stakes wager in a region where the margin for error is razor-thin. The outcome won't just determine Burkina Faso's trajectory. It will set a precedent for how the rest of Africa navigates the increasingly polarized world ahead. The Sahel has chosen confrontation over compliance, and the consequences, good or bad, are coming.